Welcome to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Joni.
And I'm Tara.
This week on the podcast, we hosted Liv Albert, who is the host of her own podcast, Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, which is all about Greek mythology, looking at Greek mythology through a modern lens. She is also a former Kobo employee. Tara, you used to work with Liv, right?
I did. Her desk used to be right across from mine. So she worked at Kobo back in the day and then has moved on to different publishing aspects, but started this podcast about Greek mythology, and it just took off. So we were lucky enough to get to chat to her because she's releasing her first book, which is out right now, and you can get it on ebook and audiobook on Kobo. Liv does the audiobook herself, obviously being the, narrator pro. But yeah, it is called Greek Mythology, the Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook. And basically, if you're like me and you don't really know anything about Greek mythology, this is like a really good resource to just dip in and out and just be like, oh, who was Zeus? Like, it tells you everything about it. I feel like, Joni, you're probably already too advanced.
I still want to read it, though. I thought Liv was deeply, deeply cool. I'm very excited about this interview. It was really fun. She's doing just the coolest thing. Like, she's made something that she loves into her career, and she's super intelligent. And yeah, she was great. So without further ado, here's the interview.
Liv, welcome to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. Really great to have you on as a former Koboite who sat at the desk across from me for, I was going to say many years, but many months at least anyway.
Many months.
Yeah, excited to have you here to chat about your first book and everything. So yeah, for anyone that's not familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I would love to. And thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to talk to everyone, and especially old Kobo people. So I first worked at Kobo in publishing and did some years at Penguin Random House, and then gave it all up and moved away and randomly started a podcast on a whim, which is now why I am worth talking to. So I'm the host of the podcast, Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. A name which I never actually like saying out loud when other people are present, but I've stuck myself with it. It's a Greek and Roman mythology podcast where I retell stories from Greek mythology in a incredibly casual and swear-filled way. And then that led me to writing a book. So I now have an upcoming book of Greek mythology called Greek Mythology, the Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook, which is available on March 23rd.
Very exciting. I think we're timing this so your book is currently out now because we're in the future. So you can get it on Kobo. You can get the ebook and the audiobook, or buy a print edition for the beautiful illustrations. So.
Or both, or all three.
Both. Oh, yes, of course. I'm surprised that you didn't sing your Let's Talk About Myths, Baby.
Nope. I have enough trouble saying it out loud and when other people are present. So I certainly don't sing it, but I do sing it every time on the podcast. I will say that.
Just to your cat.
Like the name. It's great.
Thank you. I've been told a lot that it's what got people hooked on the podcast. So it certainly worked well, but it's definitely like a random passing thought that I had. And I was like, I guess I'll call it that. And then I didn't totally expect that, 3.5 years later, I would have this fairly large platform where I have to sing a very dorky podcast name every week.
So what drew you to Greek mythology? How did you get started?
I've always been really into it. So ever since I was a kid, I think I had a good teacher in elementary school who covered it, and that kind of got me in. And then I did my undergrad I did a double major in classical civilizations and English lit with the intention of explicitly using my English lit degree to work in publishing, and then doing classics just for fun. And then sort of did that for a little while and then switched. So it's definitely always been my thing. I just find it incredibly fascinating. The stories are fascinating, but they're also just ridiculous. And that's something that I wanted to do with my podcast, is emphasize just how ridiculous some of the stories are, because it's so old and ancient that people tend to focus on sort of the brilliance of the ancient Greeks and all the things they did. And then the complete madness of some of the stories gets left behind in a lot of those interpretations. So I sort of took it upon myself to give the absolute most just bananas versions of the myths.
Yeah, I think people tend to take the myths very seriously, like it's almost gospel, So I do like the take that you're just trying to bring the silliness back to it.
And it's there. I'll never understand how people do overlook the silliness, because some of the things they do, I mean, between transforming into animals and, just there's a lot going on in Greek mythology.
So what do you think it is about myths that remain so interesting to people even now? Like, why? What is it about these stories?
The stories are pretty eternal. There's a lot of stories of romance that really translate through the ages. That said, there's a lot of stories of assault. Most of the time it's assault and kidnapping and lots of good stuff like that. But I mean, they are just eternal. And the nice thing about certainly the ancient Greek pantheon of gods is that they were very human. And I think that's what makes them so accessible and so timeless is, as much as they were gods, they also made decisions and mistakes and everything as if they were human. The Greeks definitely made them in their image to a very literal degree. So I think that just keeps the stories really fresh. And that said, though, I mean, they have carried on in a way that I personally wasn't expecting. I started this podcast because I just love it. And then it turned out that I'd sort of inadvertently fallen into this perfect resurgence of Greek mythology, where it is just huge right now in so many different forms of pop culture and in so many different places. So I just also had really good timing for people just finding it all on their own.
What do you think that modern day writers can learn from Greek mythology, if anything?
The drama certainly translates to modern writing. I mean, there's so many really brilliant adaptations of Greek myth that are coming out in fiction right now. And so I think that it's clear that the stories are so timeless that, they're just as complex and fascinating today as any fiction can be. So, I mean, looking at those stories and learning from even just the storytelling aspect, the building of tension and drama and so many different things, it's very much the same as the way we write and take in stories now.
I think that's a really good point, all about the kind of, I guess, like you said, about the humanizing the gods and characters so much throughout the stories. One of the things that I love so much about like your podcast is that you give your modern eye to the myths, like you said, like highlighting like the problematic issues and, adding historical context for, people. I think it's just like giving a basis of like, this is why this is happening for this reason. And you're saying your episodes in March are going to be dedicated to like the women in Greek mythology that are like misrepresentations. Why do you think it's so important to have this sort of modern retelling? And as you said, that there's a little bit of a resurgence right now. Are a lot of the resurgence kind of looking at it with this critical modern eye?
I think so, yeah. I mean, certainly a lot of the fiction is, because it tends to be all written by women. So a lot of it is coming out as feminist interpretations, which I am deeply here for. And yes, so all of March is going to be stories of women that were sort of misrepresented over time and misconstrued to their detriment. But I definitely focus on it through a modern eye and specifically through a feminist lens, because I mean, like we are in now, the ancient Greek world was very much a patriarchy, but one that was incredibly troubling. And women weren't recognized as citizens of the polis. They were property of their fathers until they were property of their husbands. And that translated into the mythology. So most of the stories of so-called gods falling in love with women, be they mortal or other deities, tends to be portrayed as falling in love, or the woman being carried off is a phrase that's used a lot. Of course, this means kidnapping. It means she was taken by force. And yet, the interpretations tend to sugarcoat that or just completely gloss over it like it wasn't a big deal. And, because contextually, the woman was property, so they didn't see it as a big deal. But I don't think there's any reason to tell these stories now without pointing out that that's awful and horrifying. So that's certainly what I do. I come at it from that lens of, they understood this to be the way things were, but we don't have to. And let me tell you why it's awful and messed up and, just so deeply problematic. So I think that's really important. And I think it's proven by the number of people that get angry at me for it, rather, which is not that many, thankfully, but the people that do get angry are darkly misogynistic in their anger. And I think that just proves the point of not ignoring those things. Like, people tend to come at me with like, well, you can't put our modern morals onto the ancient cultures. And I just think, why? Why not? I want to, and I'm going to, because I don't see how you can tell these stories without looking at that, because in doing so, you're basically just relegating women to the same position they were in back then, which we don't need to still be doing, because it's problematic enough as it is today, without also, ignoring the fact that it was not great that women were property.
How much of that do you think is also, in fact, part of like the people that are doing the interpretations being mostly men, like historically as well?
Oh,
has that shifted?
Yeah, hugely that. Yeah. It's definitely that, because, they didn't even have to think about it critically. It was just like, oh yeah, the god fell in love with her and carried her off. Oh, what did she think about it? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. So that's definitely a huge part of it, and what I want to, take away from, or just like provide a counter to. So certainly that's something that I'm really excited about my book for, because I obviously have read a lot of books of Greek mythology. I own a ton of them, and I don't think I've come across any that point out the level of problematization that goes into these stories. Sometimes there'll be a little bit of like reflection on that, maybe that wasn't great, but it's pretty minimal. And the main one would be like Edith Hamilton, who was a woman. She wrote her book a very long time ago, though, so it still doesn't have that like kind of modern feminism at all, but she was a little bit more honest, at least. But yeah, it's definitely to do with the men, and certainly the people who, come at me on the internet for what I'm saying are men as well.
Do you have a favorite goddess or god or story?
There's so many. I tend to fall back on Medusa, because it's very complex, and also because it makes misogynists angry. Because her story is it's a major example of misrepresentation in the way it's been understood through time. So if you actually go back into the sources, she's not super monstrous. It's pretty questionable about how much of a monster she actually was. She had snakes for hair, sure, but that tends to be the extent of her overall monstrosity. And yet we have this idea of her being this horrifying figure who absolutely needed to be killed, to save humanity or save whoever. But if you actually go back to the ancient sources, that's not really true at all. And often she's actually the victim of a god and forced to live that way because of the actions of a god. So I think she's just a fascinating figure, both in the original stories from ancient Greece, but then also in the way that she has been received over time, and the way that she's sort of been degraded and overlooked or transformed into this thing that she wasn't originally.
How much research do you have to do for each episode? And this is kind of a two-part question. I'm also curious, because it's really easy to get bogged down in Greek mythology, but how do you choose like how to distill it down and make it really accessible for relatively short form podcasts?
My episodes have gotten longer and longer over time, as I have found that less and less possible, mostly just out of my own need to tell the stories in their entirety. So definitely a lot of research goes in. It depends kind of what type of story I'm telling. And because certain ones don't require that much research, because there's maybe one source, like say the stories from the Odyssey, you're just reading the Odyssey. But when it comes to most of the other myths, we're talking a number of sources that were each either, told orally and then at some point written down over the course of hundreds, sometimes 1,000 years. So the stories change a lot between sources, and I like to reference different sources and make sure that I'm telling the complete story or the different variations of it in certain ways. Often I'll pick one to keep the narrative flowing, but ultimately I want to make it clear how many different versions there are. And because it was covered over so many hundreds of years, it can change a lot. So yeah, definitely a lot of research, sometimes less than others, but it's a lot. It's a lot of work.
How did you get started with the podcast?
When I left publishing in Toronto, I had what can only be described as a quarter life crisis in doing it. I quit my job because it was going nowhere and paid nothing, and Toronto was so expensive and so many things were going on. And so I just left Toronto, and I thought Vancouver was the solution for me. And then my job there was so much worse than anything I could have ever imagined. And I was very bored and very lonely and only listened to podcasts, and then was like, I could do this. I specifically listened to My Favorite Murder, in which case the beginning, they basically say, we just did this because we felt like it. And I was like, hey, if they did it because they felt like it, I could do it because I feel like it. And so I used it as a way for me to have something to do to pass the time, to feel less lonely and less resentful of my job. And then I quickly obviously left Vancouver, thank God, and found a better job that wasn't so soul sucking and just kept the podcast going. And I don't want to say before long because it was years, but now it is my whole job. So it clearly worked out pretty well. But it definitely happened because I was bored and lonely and liked podcasts myself.
Okay, so it's only been three and a half years that you've built up like a really great audience. I'm curious because when you started it, obviously you wouldn't have known what it was going to end up as. Did you release one episode at a time? Did you kind of prepare and bank a few episodes? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I did a lot of Googling before I started it of sort of the best way of doing things. I did it all very much by just Googling and figuring out what the internet told me to do. So some things I did well at first and some things not so well. So I know I released 2 episodes on the first run because they said that was good. And then it was going once a week, and then I was doing it kind of twice a week. And then before long, it was once a week again. And then it was once every 2 weeks because of how much work it was. And then slowly realizing, because the thing is, obviously, if you release it once a week, at least, you're more likely to gain followers and listeners and everything. And then that grows and grows. And so it sort of fluctuated in how steady it was. I definitely never banked episodes, which was my biggest flaw and a thing that I still wish I had done. And I'm now full time and I still don't bank episodes because I'm so bad at it. It's a mess. I'm literally, after we're done this call, I'm going to record the episode, or I'm going to edit, I should say. I did record it yesterday. I'm going to edit the episode that has to come out tomorrow morning. Like, that's where I'm at even now. But I just kind of figured it all out. But when the pandemic hit, I started doing it twice a week, which was the sort of big catalyst to push downloads even more, because that's kind of the most ideal. It's so much work, but it makes a big difference.
And you do everything yourself, the editing, all of it?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think, and this is just a brag, but one that I'm very proud of. I'm pretty sure I'm one of the biggest, if not the biggest, Canadian independent podcast that is just one person.
That's amazing.
Congratulations. That's so good.
Yeah, it's a lot of work for me, but I can't imagine giving much of it up. I've had one person helping with some bit of research recently, which has been nice. But even still, I haven't had a chance to use her research yet. So it's all kind of relative. But no, it's somehow still all me for all of it.
That's really cool. And it's very like indie publishing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you ever worry about running out of content? You have so many episodes, but I guess there's infinite myths, right?
There's definitely going to be a point, but I'm nowhere near it yet, fortunately, both because there are so many stories I haven't told, including like a whole host of Greek plays, right? They were really prolific playwrights, and we don't have, thousands of plays that they did write back then, but we have enough now that I can really draw upon those. I have, but not even, touch the surface of how many there are. And also at the very beginning, I told the stories very peripherally with minimal research. I sometimes use Wikipedia in the first few episodes, which is very ashamed of. So there's definitely a lot that I could redo in much better detail now that I've sort of found my stride and figured out the best way of doing it and have so many more sources at my fingertips. And so between redoing some really old ones and the sheer volume that I haven't yet done, there's going to be a long time to go, fortunately.
Yeah, and I noticed that you had on your Patreon that you've done in Irish, you did Cuchulainn. Would you veer into different myths? Because I have a whole bunch of Irish myths that I can tell you about.
I might veer a little bit into Egyptian because I also care about those. The Cuchulainn one came across because I am very good friends with the women in the podcast Ancient History Fangirl. We met in the pandemic and through podcasting and turned into like having video chats once a week to keep us all sane in lockdowns. And they cover histories far beyond the ancient Mediterranean. And they knew the story of Cuchulainn, and we do Patreons together where we just drink too much and then tell myths to each other, which is what Cuchulainn was. And it is messy, that one. So they told me the myth of Cuchulainn, and I just sort of like listened in a bit of awe. But I just find personally, I don't have the passion for ones beyond Greek and Roman for it to be the same podcast. It would just be me researching, but it wouldn't have the same level just because I don't have the same feelings for it. The Cuchulainn one certainly, was giving Greek a run for its money in the craziness that was going on in there. But yeah, it's just not the same for me, unfortunately, because it would mean so much more content.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of like turning into animals and witches and all this like good stuff in Irish folklore as well.
Well,
I know, and I have Irish friends.
Tara.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go. I'll be nipping at your heels, Liv.
I mean, you've actually got you being Irish. That makes a big difference. I am in no way Greek, so you can one-up me there.
Well, there actually is this great podcast called the Irish History Podcast. He covers a lot of this, and yeah, it's really, really great. And it's been going for a few years where he goes through all of them. So I think I missed my window of opportunity.
There you go. You should just guest on it.
Should call him up. So to shift gears a little bit into writing, as this is kind of, for our independent authors here. So it sounds like you do a lot of research for each episode, and like, do you write them out? Because it kind of sometimes sounds like you're reading it. Sometimes sounds like you're kind of just riffing.
Yeah, it's all scripted. Yeah, it's all scripted.
Okay. Yeah, because doing it on your own is a ton of pressure if you're not scripting it.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine, honestly. My scripts are often down to likes, to my use of the word like, and just to emphasize it, because also if I didn't write them, then I would say it a lot more. Like that. No, they're definitely all scripted. So the way I do it, which is probably not the most practical way, but it is the quickest, is I literally have like a book on one side and my laptop on my lap, and I'm just reading and then typing as I go. So I just am like reading and typing and coming up with it on the fly. So it is still very much thought up on the fly, but it's written down so that I can read it afterwards and not actually like have the pressure of recording it while I'm in that way. But I also notoriously do all that and then never read it again before I'm recording. So, I mean, it's all still very messy, but it works, which is great. So yeah, it's a lot of reading while typing and then just saving a document and hoping it's worthwhile when I open it in front of my microphone later.
So I was going to ask, like, what's the main difference between like the writing process for an episode versus a book? And I have to assume that there was a lot of differences between the two.
Not as much as I think I would have expected. The biggest thing was that for this book, it was commissioned. So Simon & Schuster, or Adams Media with Simon & Schuster rather, came to me to write it. And so they had very strict wants and needs for it. So what I actually found myself doing was the hardest thing was whittling it down to the word count they wanted, or at times stretching it out to the word count they wanted. Because of course, they were coming at it from a structural publishing point of view, and I was coming at it from okay, but sometimes there just isn't enough information about this god because this is an oral culture from 2000, like over 2,000 years ago. So, this is kind of where we're at. Meanwhile, it's like, okay, but this guy has, pages and pages and pages of content, and I need to whittle it down to 700 words. So that part was the thing that was most different, because otherwise, I have my sources, I have my style, I have it, it was definitely a lot less conversational in the way I had to write it. But the biggest issue was definitely fitting it within the sort of template that I had.
What did you learn about writing from writing the book? Because do you keep your voice, I guess? Like, it's kind of, it has your own tone to it. It's not necessarily like you're writing a structural, like academic history of something. So was that easier, or was that sort of harder because it's your own tone and voice?
It was a little of both, definitely, because it was my tone, but it wasn't the tone of the podcast. Ideally, one day I write a really epically long book of Greek mythology fully in the tone of the podcast. But in this case, it needed to be conversational, and it needed to be accessible and pop culture related in a way that I don't always do in the podcast. So it was a lot of kind of finding a voice within those things and still making it me, and still making it really accessible and fun and not dry and stuffy. And then also trying to make sure it sounded all the same throughout. That was one of the weirdest things because I had to write a couple of chapters as a proposal. And then when I actually got down to writing the book, like I personally can still see the big difference in those chapters that I wrote for the proposal versus the rest of the book. Even trying to like make it all fit later, I can still really note how different they seem just because they were written early. And then, you know, a couple months later, I wrote the rest of it. So
I'm going to try and spot them.
Please.
On a similar kind of note, so with your podcast, you're a completely independent creator and you make all the decisions about everything. And then this book was commissioned and you were kind of at the whims of your publishing house. How did you find that? Was it difficult to relinquish that?
Yeah, it was weird. It was definitely weird because, of course, a commissioned book is a very specific thing. So that part was very odd. And also trying to make sure that while I want this book to be, I mean, wonderful, and it is, and I wanted it to be my voice, and it is, but I also didn't want to take away from my future ability to write a book of mythology that is fully me and fully from the podcast. And, you know, like I wanted this to be enough based in the podcast that we can all capitalize off of that, but then also separate enough that I don't take away from any future abilities to write a real book based on the podcast.
You have like many years of working in the publishing industry and worked within the contracts for Penguin Random House for some time. Did this help you in any of the negotiations? Like, did you feel like you had a little bit of insider knowledge?
Damn right. Yeah, it absolutely did. No, that part was very fun. And then also seeing different contracts, because I still have a lot of the Penguin Random House Canada boilerplate contract memorized. So that was very interesting to see how another house handled the contract and the way they did it. And I definitely was able to negotiate a nicer package because I knew what I was asking for and I knew, you know, the ins and outs of that world, and even find little mistakes because I'm a huge dork for contracts. So it was kind of fun to be that author who's like not just going to sign the contract, but also be like, are you sure you want to phrase it this way because of, you know, this, and this about weird book publishing contract intricacies.
I like that you're able to challenge them. You're like, I could get out of this, you know, I'm just telling you.
I have warned them too. I was like, just so you know, before you read what I'm about to say, is I used to work for Penguin Random House. I think it's a good warning to be made of I'm not looking at this from like completely fresh, never seen a book publishing contract eyes before.
That's an awesome position to be in, though.
It was fun.
Is there anything that you'd advise that authors look out for when they're signing publishing contracts?
Oh, that's so interesting. It's hard without, you know, seeing anything or knowing what's available, but definitely asking for more because they're always going to start with their lowest. You know, they're going to start with their lowest offer. They're going to start with their lowest royalties. So doing some research on industry standards and, you know, what could be possible, because certainly a lot of authors don't know, or they're too focused on being excited to have a book deal, which is a very exciting thing. And you don't want to mess that up, you know? So you got to kind of work your way, the best way of asking for more and asking for your worth without, you know, ruffling enough feathers that you lose anything. But always, and in any contract, they're going to start low. That's the way it works. So, you know, there's no harm in asking for something a little different. I personally was very happy with how it went on my end, where I asked for a lot because I know when you ask for a lot, you get like half of it and then you're happy. And I got like most of it. So I was like, oh, I almost could have asked for more probably because, you know, I was coming at it from the way we did it at PRH, and maybe they do it differently there. So it's interesting because I only have that experience of working for Penguin, but, you know, everyone does do it a little bit differently, but certainly asking for more because there's absolutely no harm. And the worst they're going to say is no.
I think that's a great point. If you don't ask, you don't get. Like, simple as
exactly.
that.
Especially as women, because we don't ask for things often. And it's why, you know, they have this whole reasoning of women not getting paid as much. And they always say it's because women don't ask. And of course, that's not an acceptable reason. But regardless, you know, push past it and just ask for your worth all the time.
Yeah. And you do this all yourself. So do you have an agent or anything for the publishing side, or was it just that they approached you directly?
No, because they approached me, it wasn't really necessary. It would have just taken a cut out of the contract, or the deal. I certainly want one for future books, but at this point, it was unnecessary, fortunately. So for the book, no, it was definitely just me. For the podcast, I have like an ad company is the only thing I work with outside of myself. Like they sell all the ads and give me money, and then the rest is me.
Nice. So it is there's quite the similarity between an independent author kind of running their own business, because this podcast is your business now and you're like running it as a business. So do you have any advice for people that are starting out, especially when it's like a business around a creative endeavor? Like you don't really want to, I mean, that's great because you love what you do, but you also don't want to sully the waters with kind of putting a value on what you're doing either. So what would your advice be for that?
Oh yeah, that's very hard. I mean, a lot of it is just research, I would say, and figuring out the best way of doing anything. I don't think that I really have all the answers on any of it. The fact that it is my full business now and actually pays the bills is entirely because one particular ad company approached me when they were launching in Canada. And if it weren't for them, I would still be making like fine money, but not pays all the bills money. So it's really tough. And so I think doing research and finding the ways of making it, you know, sustainable and worth your effort and your time, but also just powering through. Like, I mean, if I hadn't had the listenership that I do and how lovely the listeners are for these years, I probably would have given up at some point, because I'm just not the type of person who can push through on something, even if they love it, when there's absolutely no reception to it or no growth or anything. Like I have to see change. I have to see growth and you know, I have to see something tangible from it. So I think pushing through it and keep working at it until you see that growth is what's worth it, because, you know, I definitely just kept trying and trying. I never got complacent on, well, okay, I'll just, you know, keep the listenership like this without, you know, pushing and pushing to see how much I could grow it. And then of course now it's grown enough that I don't have to do that quite as much anymore, because yeah, you know, so it's just about sort of keeping things moving. I don't know if that's good advice. I don't know how to give advice.
You're doing very well.
I think it's great advice. I think it's really that you've done this. I think it's awesome. And I suspect I know the answer to this, but was your business affected in any way by COVID, or has it pretty much just continued as normal?
At the beginning, it was. At the beginning, I saw a huge drop in my numbers, and then the ad company that I was with at the time saw a huge drop. I had ads canceled. I had, you know, notifications that nothing was going to be incoming. And I personally panicked quite a lot. And at the very beginning too, I had it affect my ability to be creative in certain ways. But then, and this is where it's sort of awkward to be in my position in this really messy time we're living through, then it rebounded and everything got like 1,000 times better. And it only grew significantly during the pandemic. And, you know, I sort of found everything that I needed to make it a full-time living all during this mess. So it's been a very bizarre time, because it definitely only got better.
But I think it's the same for publishing. And I think you're not exploiting people to do better. You're bringing people something that they really need at a really hard time. So I think it's a really awesome thing that creative industries are being rewarded, because they're often not. And also that you're able to do something that's keeping people distracted.
Yeah, that's very true. That's kind of reassuring with it all.
I like that you're reading the classics as part of your podcast as well, and as part of Myths Baby, and that you're currently going through the Odyssey. And I was curious if you had ever thought about publishing these as an audiobook.
Definitely, because they're public domain, which is why I'm able to read them, which is great. That's basically what I'm doing for the fact that I do 2 episodes per week. I started it during the pandemic because I was bored and was like, hey, I could just read the Iliad to you guys. Like, that's something for all of us to do. And it turned out to be perfect, because now my ad company is like, you have to have 2 episodes per week for us to keep this going. And I'm like, okay, great. Thankfully, there's enough public domain. The public domain is a bit lacking, unfortunately, in terms of translations, because obviously the content's in the public domain, but you have to find a translation that's in the public domain. But I've definitely thought about it. I would go back and redo certain parts for sure, because at the beginning it was kind of similar to the beginning of this podcast, where I was just kind of like figuring it out as I go. The Odyssey ones I'm very happy with, because they've been really fun and I love the Odyssey. So I've kind of found my reading aloud voice. But it's definitely something I've considered in the audiobook world.
Well, there's this very friendly platform that lets you upload audiobooks. It's called Kobo Writing Life. You could do it all on your own. I mean, we would obviously help, but just, keep us in mind.
Good to know. The one thing I've learned in recording my own audiobook for my regularly published book is that audiobooks are meant to be recorded at a very low quality. So I almost wonder if mine are too high of a quality, because I don't know if it's a Kobo thing or just an Audible thing, but down with Audible. But but definitely I've found that I had to lower my recording quality for the audiobook versus the podcast, which has been interesting.
I wonder if it's just the files being bigger. Do you know, Tara?
Size. I don't. I know that we encourage people to bring the higher quality, and then because we do it all in-house, we do some magic on the back end so the customer's not downloading this giant file. But yeah, that's kind of curious.
No, I'll look at the Kobo requirements, because maybe they're not quite like that. But yeah, they've had me go from recording at 32-bit to 16-bit and some other things that I didn't totally understand.
Interesting. Did you find it quite a smooth transition to recording an audiobook, given what you already do?
Definitely smoother than I expected, and smoother than my producer expected. We got it done 2 days earlier than they thought, because this is just what I do all the time.
That's unheard of in audiobook production, I think.
Because we had to do it at night, because there's really incredible construction on outside of this apartment that I'm desperately aching to be out of permanently. They're building a condo directly outside my windows, not a street over, but within 6 feet of my apartment building, they're putting up a high-rise condo. So I'm excited to be gone. But it meant we didn't start until 6 p.m. every night. And my poor producer was in Central Time, so she's 2 hours later than me. And it was quite interesting. But yeah, she'd scheduled 5 nights of 3 to 4 hours each. And we did it in 3 of less than 3 hours each. So it was very nice. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Felt good.
I'm very excited to listen to it. Yeah, it's going to be a great addition. And yeah, you can definitely get it on Kobo. And we flagged with the team because, want to give former Kobo people some love. And then speaking of, our favorite question to ask people that come on the podcast is, what have you been loving lately? So it could be a book, TV, movie, anything that's taken your fancy. Podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. Right now, I feel like everything is up in arms in my life. What's the last thing? I recently read Natalie Haynes's book, 1,000 Ships, which has just come out in North America. And also I had to read it because I had her on my podcast. So that includes a little plug for me as well. But it was incredibly good. So it's one of those recent adaptations of Greek myth that I've talked about because there are so many coming out right now. And it's essentially a retelling of the story of the Iliad, but through the eyes of all the women involved, and the Odyssey too, I should say. And it's really, really good and made me very happy to read.
That's a great recommendation. I've actually, that one's been on my list for a while, along with
so good
4,000 billion other books.
I know that feeling.
What's your favorite adaptation?
That's definitely up there, I would say. And I really like Natalie Haynes' other book called The Children of Jocasta, which is a retelling of a story of the Oedipus myth. That's really good too. And then The Song of Achilles is iconically so good. But there are just so many lately. It's crazy how many are coming out, and it's been great for the podcast because it means the authors want publicity.
Nice. So be sure to keep an eye on the people that you have coming.
It's really racking up.
Where can listeners find you online?
I am wherever you can find podcasts. You can listen to Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. I almost sung it and then I didn't.
Do it.
Okay, every time I open the podcast, it is Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, which I can't sing, so I don't know how I've gotten myself into this, but that's what it is. So you can find it anywhere, Apple, Spotify, what have you. And then I am otherwise Myths Baby on all of the various social media, or mythsbaby.com is my website.
Awesome. Thank you. We will post the links to that in our podcast show notes. And by the time this comes out, your book will be available to buy.
Wonderful. And then a reminder, because I always forget, it's called Greek Mythology, the Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in Liv's book, we'll share the detail in the show notes, but you can get the ebooks and audiobooks on Kobo. And this is also a rare occasion. We'd recommend hit up your local indie bookstore to try and see this book in person because the illustrations are really beautiful. If you'd like to listen to her podcast, it's called Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, and you can find it wherever you'd like to listen to podcasts. It was just featured on Esquire's top 15 list of podcasts you should listen to in 2021, so can't recommend it enough.
This episode was produced by Tara Kremen and Joni DiPlacido with assistance from Rachel Wharton. Editing is done by Kelly Robotham. Music is provided by Tearjerker, and big thanks to Liv Albert for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your writing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writing life. Until next time, happy writing.